There we go. We're live. Hello, my friends. I have read 3 books. I've read 3 novels since I started reading this one aloud and been a little distracted. So now we're getting back to focus. The Mechanicus came for their harvest of invalids and mutants. And so I'm assuming semi-attractive protagonist will have to deal with this. They're getting away. Davian pushed past the cluster of survivors, hunting out anyone of authority. The congregation was in disarray. A great swath of the faithful had just taken, already receding in those 2 huge cages, and with them Neem, her brother, or what Dr. Tiesling had made of him. Please! She could hear the crackle and buzz of the Skitarii weapons, lancing the boil of the crowd outside before it could erupt of its own accord. We can catch them! She could see through the broken doors and empty rooms to the further chambers, where the aunts and uncles lived. The conscription pool hadn't pushed as far as it might, at least. They only had so much room in their cages. They hadn't reached the aunts and uncles, still less the great aunts and great uncles. The elder generations of the congregation waiting for the promised time when they would rise up and prove their worthiness to the emperor. And now that time had come, as far as Davian was concerned, and nobody was doing anything. A stooped figure craned out of the dim inner rooms, set one more level into the city's foundations. Many of the aunts and uncles were so blessed by the emperor that they could never be mistaken for a mere human. But the Magus Clares might just be a tired old woman. Old. On Marad, Clares, on Marad, meaning she was past 40. Her waxy bluish pale skin sagged in wrinkles, and her eyes were yellow, and there were leathery ridges climbing up her forehead and back over her scalp. The ravages of time had swallowed up the marks of divinity. She still carried, though, an ineffable weight of authority about her shoulders as she blinked in the dim light. Magus! And Davian wasn't sure where this impertinent courage had come from. They'd let her stand in front of so august a figure and just shout, "They broke into the clinic! They took Dr. Tesling! They took Nim! And we can stop them! Call the congregation to arms! There's already a crowd out there, and..." In the face of the old woman's stare, "Every district will fight. If we show them the way, everyone has lost sons and daughters to the pool, or lost their sick and injured as offerings. The city is like spilled oil awaiting the spark, Magus." Not for the first time, Davian felt a tug in her mind as she pushed back against the Magnus's authority, frustrated that she could not move the world herself. We were promised a future. Why will you not give it to us? Sakiri has failed, Magnus Claris whispered. The very news Davian had come to bring her. But of course, Berzelum was dead. The tech priest would not be only out here so brazenly with the conscription pool. It is not the time, the Magnus said. The old woman looked at the faces around her, as though hunting out absences. Perhaps those who had just been taken. Perhaps contemporaries who had died a generation before. I had hoped, but no. We cannot rise up until the proper moment. It is not time. And Davian had lived her life with those words. Every injustice handed down from on high, every accident caused by cut corners, or the Mechanicus' drive for resources and results, every time the overseers upped the quotas and reduced the rations. We must do something. Someone would always cry, and the Magnus' withered head would shake and she'd say, "It is not the time." When Davian had been younger, that had sounded like wisdom, the long-term planning of a master game player. Now she had a shocking moment of disillusionment. A frightened old woman. Is that all she is? Did the Magus fear the blessed time of uprising? Would she rather live out her remaining years basking in the glow of an unattainable future rather than act? The time is now, she said. She'd meant to shout it, but in the face of all that misery, her voice dwindled to a croak. Please, my brother. Clarissa's wrinkled lips twisted. She held out stick-thin arms to embrace Davian. It is not the time, she said again. I listen, child. Every night I listen to the singing of the Emperor's angels. They are closer, I know. They hear our hymns and know we are faithful. But it is not time yet. We must hide ourselves away until the day comes. And if that means we sacrifice our own to the tech priest fires, then that is how it must be. The congregation must survive to pass down the truth to another generation. But Magus, I know it is hard for you to wait. Patience comes with years. And so few of us can acquire either. I'm sorry, my child. I'm sorry for your brother. I'm sorry for all of us. We are being tested, and we endure. All around, the aunts and the great uncles were emerging from the deepest recesses of the tenement, the under sewers, and the hidden cellars. Claw-nailed hands brushed her arm. Hooked talons rested on her shoulder, trying to impart a solidarity that burned away in the fires of her own anger. Would you say that to Sakiri? She demanded. If only she were here. Clarisse whispered. Child, I will tell you the bitterest truth. This might have been the day. We were ready. The conscription pool could have been the moment when we all taught everyone on Murad the many-handed emperor's promise to his children. If Sakiri had killed the fabricator general, that might have been the flame which would have set light to the city. But she failed. And she is lost to us. And so it is not the time, nor shall it be. A shuddering sigh went through the old woman. I shall not live to see it. But Magus, Davian heard her own voice shake. We rose up here. We drove them away. Sakiri might be dead, but she failed. She was taken. The great taskmaster Bazelum still lives, and Sakiri is buried beneath his palace. They will burn her with the others. At their great feast, I'm sorry, child. I waited for our time for so long. I had thought... But Davian was already breaking out of her fragile embrace. No, she said. And she wasn't sure where this courage had come from, to talk back to the Magus like this. I'll go to the Palladium. I'll find Sakiri. I'll free her. I'll kill the fabricator general myself if I have to. And she ran. Every step she waited for the quavering voice to call her back. That command she couldn't disobey. She was of the congregation, after all. There was a thread that tied her to the elders. And if they yanked hard enough on it, she could be back with them with all meek obedience. And yet the tug never came. The sad eyes of Clarisse and the other elders, human eyes, inhuman eyes, just watched her go, too broken and beaten even to call. So there's a lot going on between the lines right there. It's more than just respecting your elders. I suppose that the Jinna Stealers have a sort of... Well, okay, so first of all, something that makes them different than the rest of the Tyranids is they have like a localized sort of hive mind. They don't They can feel the larger hive mind at large, but they have tiny little compartmentalized ones. So if you combine that with the human's intelligence, they kind of like they have a strange like hybrid of a hybrid of that's how they process information. But I don't doubt that I think she was manipulated, but she was pushed. She wasn't um that's what the surprise was. Is it isn't that it didn't happen, it's just they pushed that they wanted her to do this. Even though she's like highly valuable to them, and you'll see why later. It's not going to be that much of a surprise. Um Davian as a character, I suppose if I was going to give her a character, because she does have it, she'd be a sleuth. I guess that's her thing, is she's a sleuth. Getting to the Palladium Lucidium was easy. Her skin was imprinted with electus and noosphere auras, forgeries and copies painstakingly needled into her flesh by Dr. Teesling. At the doors of the Palladium, the servitors mutely parsed the codes before letting her through. Just one more cog in their grand machine. And the run up to Ascension Day, there was plenty of traffic between Lucidium and the city of Octorites. Getting in was one thing, of course. She knew roughly where the tech priest held captives. But those wings of the palace were not somewhere a gutter clerk like her would be expected to present herself. These were not purpose-built cells exactly, but test chambers given over to temporary storage of living bodies. The lords of the Adeptus Mechanicus would go there to select subjects for their experiments, to test this augmentation or that weapon. Nobody was a long-term resident there. If the testing itself did not destroy them, they would be incinerated later. Davian had been a Lucidium clerk for 2 years now. The tech priests had tested her for intelligence and initiative, and she had been more than able to parrot their orthodoxy back to them. Divine blood ran in her veins. She looked as human as anyone on Maraud, but her mind was not dulled by the poisons and sickness that plagued the population at large. No wonder she was one of the few given a place at the Palladium. Her journey through the palace was a stop-start of bureaucracy. Every junior tech priest was the plaything of their superiors, which meant they wielded an iota of their authority like a lash at every opportunity. Here was one, now, a gangling adolescent, pallid skin turned red and angry about the freshly implanted cables beneath his ear. "You clerk, present yourself!" His voice was nasal and high. "I am an important missive for you to carry." And she knew he had no such thing. But who would concoct some meaningless code to pass to some other equally insignificant acolyte just to feel himself part of the great machine of Lucidium? If she let him, he and those like him would devour her whole day with their meaningless shuddering back and forth. Adept. And she bowed meekly enough. But within her sleeves, her hands were pressing at the electus set to her forearms, poking her nails painfully here and here, until she had reconfigured her ephemeral codes that spoke from her body to the wider Palladium. "Forgive me, but I am at the command of Hermeticus Aberradian. Please direct your query to an available servant." And Aberradian was a good name to conjure with, senior both in authority and age. Seldom seen outside his chambers to be questioned. The junior was hard to put off even with that. She could feel him prying at the strictures of her electus, desperate to feel himself superior to someone. "My missive is of surpassing urgency for the ongoing subroutines of the Omnissiah," he insisted readily. "Forgive me, but I am bound by the overriding priorities of parsonomy and cannot undertake any further tasks until current demands are satisfied. She knew all the proper calls and responses, addresses and quotes from the scripture. Clarisse and the ants had tutored her extensively on that semi-familiar creed that felt like a twisted echo of the congregation's own orthodoxy. And so grim. The litany of the tech priest was all cogs and machine, the privilege of being a small piece until you were all ground down and replaced. The congregation preached optimism. Davian had lived her whole life in the hope that she would see the day the emperor blessed her with his angels, descending like stars from the heavens to bring the promised union between their divine flesh and that of their mortal faith. Soon enough, she had dodged free of her interrogator and found what she was looking for: a hole in the wall where repairs were being made. Soon enough, Lucidium was a building of many walls, and in the midst of time, they had moved and shifted at the tech priest's whim, the whole building a colossal sliding block puzzle. Those mists had so rusted the mechanisms that none of it moved now. But the walls were still full of ancient machinery, ducts and power lines, each one a hollow maze in miniature. And Davian was small and lithe, and had spent her childhood getting in and out of twisted places. She entered the walls, writhing and clambering through the jigsaw of interlocking gaps within them, scrambling up and down conduits, dropping past the stilled blades of great fans, landing in the cold bellies of extinct furnaces. In her mind was a plan of the Palladium, and where those off-limits text chambers were. She burrowed through the fabric of the Lucidium like a worm until the last hatch opened creakily, and she saw below her a chamber lined with great bell jars. These were the cells used by the adepts for their experiments, 13 feet high, made of clear armor glass, which was as tough as plasteel, unless precisely the correct frequencies were used to disrupt it. Those stored within could be held indefinitely, or else the container itself could be a fatal testing chamber for whatever gas or weapon the tech priest wished to deploy. There were Scutari on the move below, and she froze, watching the red-coated cyborgs manhandle another string of bound prisoners along a gantry, dropping them into a jar without much care for how they landed. Many of the captives had to be virtually dragged along, too weak or sick to walk on their own. Some looked as though they'd already died since being taken by the pool. These were not the conscripts, destined to fight in the Imperium's wars. They were the offerings, whose agonies would serve as a highlight to the tech priest's great celebration. Davian bared her teeth at the thought. She knew the doctrine well enough. The Adeptus Mechanicus claimed to be working towards perfection. They preached the creed of Forge and Factorum, where things were remade and tested, and where testing revealed flaws, they held it an act of faith to consign the broken and the weak to be melted down. Davian knew well that they would look upon most of the congregation and burn them in a heartbeat. Cruel. They are cruel. Oh my gosh. Okay, so that's cool actually, because that last part didn't sound like her voice. It wasn't written like her. It was something else. That sometimes every once in a while there's a little bit of the book that's like written in italics. I didn't get this reading it just by myself, but it's definitely the influence of the hive mind or something else. Some either another player or something, but something is feeding her thoughts. Not necessarily leading her along, but reinforcing what she thinks she knows is already right. I guess that's schizophrenia. Una más. Cruel. They are cruel. When the Skitari had gone, she let herself down the gantry, creeping along and peering into each glass cell in turn. She saw some of the congregation there. One jar filled with beaten, listless people from her own clave, and a scattering across the other cells. Her hands itched to try and rescue them, but there was no way she could get them out of the place undetected. Sakiri, though. Sakiri was a hero. She had struck against the tech priest time and time again. She was swift and strong and blessed. Surely Davian could release her and bring her back to Clarisse, and the Magnus would smile at her again, and there would be hope. In the furthest bell jar, she saw Sakiri, alone. They had not been kind to her. She was pinned to a frame, all 5 limbs outstretched, with a host of instruments around her. There were tubes jammed into her flesh, and to the softer skin between her joints. One of her eyes had been removed, and several of her teeth and nails. She had been left with no more clothing than the prudishness of the tech priest mandated, meaning her divinely touched physiology was on full display. To Davian, she was beautiful, a being in whom the divine bloodline ran strong. The long sweep of her skull, the polished ridges of her armored skin, the sickle claws of her third hand, all these things spoke of the many-handed emperor's love for his chosen. To the tech priests, they would merely be something imperfect, to consign to the flames. And they were not taking her thread lightly, even secure as she was. A full dozen Skitari stood around her cell, staring outwards as though Sakiri disgusted them. Davian crouched above them, trying to think of some distraction she could engineer to draw them away. Her mind was full of wild thoughts, freeing Sakiri, who would somehow turn from this tattered thing to a righteous avenger once more, tearing through the Palladium, waving the banner of the many-handed emperor from its balconies. She almost missed the feet on the gantry, feeling the vibrations through her hands and knees, just in time to scurry back to her niche against the wall. It was a tech priest. The devices on his robe speaking of seniority within the genetic order. A contradiction, then. A man who should have been powerful, save that his particular craft was not well regarded on Marad. And familiar, surely. The man who had led the charge against Tesling's clinic. And alone. He stared down at Sakiri, as much as Davian had, and had stepped over a bank of levers, throwing them in a complex order until a sling descended from above the hatch atop Sakiri's jar groaned open. The Skitari below did not react to the sound, which could only mean that they had sent a voiceless instruction to that effect. Davian hunched closer. He was an odd, lean man. His eyes, jet blue crystal lenses, edged in brass, set into the angry skin of his brow. One of his limbs was a fabrication of metal bones and the cables of artificial muscles. Not unusual for a tech priest, save that he seemed to be awkward with it, the steel hand fumbling with the hoist controls. She saw a bandolier of empty canisters slung across his chest, rattling against each other and getting in his way. Then he had stepped into the sling and was being lowered into the jar with a hiss of steam that momentarily obscured everything. When the air cleared, he was hanging over Sakiri, not risking getting within reach, even though all three arms were pinned back like a dissection subject. When the air cleared, he was hanging over Sakiri, not risking getting within reach. Justice recipient 11, 289, 221, the press intoned. Our Arbeit's engine has cross-referenced your details with current case files. 15 open cases are tagged to your identity. Do you want me to list them? His voice was like old, dead things. Most of the priests weren't used to idle conversation. Sakiri's long head shifted, and glowered up at the man. If they're for killing your kind, I confess to all of them. Death to the oppressors. Death to the Hollowmen. Her voice sounded weak, but the defiance in it thrilled through Davian. Kin speaking to kin. She found herself mouthing the words too. The tech priest chuckled, like broken gears, and his hoist dropped him another jerky yard down. He glanced out at the Skitarii, an oddly furtive gesture, and when he spoke, his tone was curiously low. I know what you are. You know nothing, Taskmaster. Your time is coming. A very particular bloodline, distributed through the claves of the South Chasm. Unauthorized representations of the omnisciac emperor that would have the Inquisition scrambling to pay your kin a visit the moment I transmitted the images. A tendency to mutations, which, viewed in aggregate, seem too uniform to be the results of heterogenic chance. And that crackled laugh emitted. You are something more than a mere assassin. Yes, she is our champion, Davian thought. Sakiri had been killing overseers, tax gatherers, and Skitarii for a year, working up to her assault on Basileum. I am the justice that is coming from beneath your boots, enslaver, Sakiri hissed. You are a corrupted hybrid of human and Xenos, the priest snapped. Do not think your rhetoric fools me. I have access to your knowledge and more knowledge that you cannot imagine. I have fed into you the teeth of our engines, and the results tell me everything about what you are and the filth that has engendered you. But I've caught you too soon, haven't I? Let me guess. The Fabricator General's death was supposed to be the start of it. You know nothing, Sakiri repeated. Her defiance had ebbed, though, and its place was not despair, but a curious humor, as though she was hanging from pins and hooks. The day will come when the sky is radiant with the Emperor's countless young taskmaster. We will join with them in the blessed union, and no human will own another, nor force them to toil. Well, it is not today, and you'll never see it. They'll excruciate you on Ascension Day, and Basileum and his cronies will warm their hands at the fire of your deviant kin. The bitterness in his voice had shifted. Davian felt it wasn't Sakiri his sour at right then. But you can still help me, creature. I will choke you, Sakiri hissed at him. He was very close now, and she craned her neck forwards, wide jaws gaping, as she tried to get her teeth into some part of his flesh. You've already helped, the dreadful rattle and catch of that laugh. I have analyzed your flesh, creature. It led me to your kin in the city. I have reaped a grand harvest of them, though none as magnificently twisted as you. I have learned the secret of what you are, and I'll have your little infection properly atomized. For which purpose? And his mechanical arm shot out a helix of needles, abruptly sliding from the knuckles. It was an artless motion, practically punching Sakiri in the chest as he ran them home. Davian saw the canisters on the bandolier fill unevenly, each fed by a hose from a different needle. You will be made to serve, the tech priest said softly. The hate was mostly gone from his voice now. He sounded almost fond. You are but components in the great machine, misaligned components, but sometimes there is a serendipity in a defective part or unintended connection. There is no greater power in the universe than the ingenuity of mankind before which all things must bow. He was muttering low to himself now, so that Davian had to lean forwards to catch the words echoing from the mouth of the jar. Shall the minds that created the Adeptus Astartes and designed the Golden Throne be daunted by this Xenos infection? No, it shall be dissected and understood, and if it contains virtues, they too shall serve the destiny of mankind. Shorn of their corruptive heritage, they shall serve. And then the hoist was abruptly in motion again, and she scurried back as he was lifted from the jar and its hatch resealed. For a moment, he was there, close enough to touch, suspecting no watchers, and letting the remaining flesh of his face sag into lines of uncertainty and worry. He fingered the flasks of stolen blood, and she saw his lips writhe black, barred teeth into a snarl. Then he was striding away, muttering to himself. She should have stayed to wrestle with the controls, trying to replicate his opening of the hatch. Save that the Scutari below were abruptly alert again, their enforced dormancy over. But she was curious. Why was this high-ranking tech priest creeping about behind the backs of his fellows? More, he was the man who had taken Neem and Dr. Tesling, and they were absent from the jar cells here. Had he already consigned them to the fires? With an agonized look at Sakiri, she hurried on soft feet after the tech priest. She would be back, she promised silently. But she had to know what had happened to her brother. She trailed the tech priest to the lower levels of the Palladium, windowless and dark peopled only by servitors and menial clerks like her. The doors opened for him as of right, while she had to stop before each portal and reconfigure the phantom authority lent to her by her electus, persuading the ancient mechanisms that she was someone permitted past their bounds. Until at last the tech priest reached a door that led to chambers reserved for the adepts alone, some private laboratory or chapel. Instead of striding through, he had paused to work a physical code lock of some interlocking sections of bronze. Her ephemeral influence would not serve against something so brutally mechanical. He would lock her out. She had one chance to follow him. She skipped to his very heels, and at his mental hand and his metal hand skittered across and wrestled with the logic codes of the door. She was close enough that she could have stabbed him. When he passed through, she was the soundless familiar in his very shadow. Beyond the door, the air reverberated with the sound of engines, as though she were abruptly in the factories again. After so long in dingy halls and cramped corridors, the space here was huge, carved out between the columns of air processing and purification pumps. Half of the ancient machines were still and dead, but the rest put out a constant rumble that shook every bone in her. The tech priests must be able to tune it out, she guessed. Or how would they ever get anything done? Amidst the columns, she saw one of the bell jar cells, transported here by who knew what contortions. There was a vast form of flesh squatting in it that could barely be reconciled as human. Hands with the fingers fused together, a vestigial limb spasming to be free of the ribs from which it had grown. She saw a broad head with two yellow eyes and a human blue one beside it, as though some process of division was taking to split him in two from the top down. And a tail. He had a tail now, ridged and tipped with a bony blade. Every line and spur and scale of him, though it might seem monstrous to another, was a plan that spoke to her. He was hatching from his humanity into something more perfect. His very flesh was yearning to escape the gross cage of the anthropoid form, to explode outwards into the perfection of the angels. Her heart caught in her throat. She ran to the jar, looking for levers, controls, anything, so she could open his prison and lift him out. He was monstrous. He was her brother, Neem. He knew her. He lurched to the clear wall of his prison, one horn-nailed hand clawing at the inside. She placed her own hand against the glass and matched the gesture, putting her in his shadow. She felt a sudden stab of jealousy, almost. That it had been him to fall ill. It had been him to receive this divine blessing through the hands of Dr. Tiesling. Even though it had left him just a prisoner here, and even though she could tell through his stare, he was filled with agony. And filled with warning, too. Perhaps he even spoke, called her name, shouted for her to flee. The jar insulated her from his words, though, and the metal hand, and then the metal hand of the tech priest was pincering her shoulder. "What do we have here?" the tech priest hissed, twisting her around to face him. "One of Berzellam's spies, is it? Or—" She saw the iris shutters of his lenses narrow, and he analyzed the girl before him. Or something else indeed. She felt a sudden jab of pain, one of his needles questing out into her flesh. Blood will go out, and until it does, out is where you will not go.